but just by putting them into, getting them online, then the queue gives you 44 weeks. Just automatically. So if that's kind of what I'm kind of adding that to your thought, it would give you 44 weeks discussion. It's almost a full year. We could grab other things, get them in, get some things done, get some bids out, and start to see if, how that starts to affect you. But it's a tough call. It was very difficult a number of years ago when I had to ask a district that was putting 12 classrooms on a building and say, you don't need 12, you only need 4. And could they really believe that? But the kids, if you're a middle school, I can find the kids in the district. When you're a kindergarten building, where are those kids? There's someplace out there, and you don't really see them. So it's difficult. It's difficult.
How is this going to affect our bus loops, parking?
Monetarily, not, because those are still constructible projects. They're not based upon space and demographics. They're capital projects. They're going to be attached to interior projects. I think those things still need to be constructed to make these operate properly, in my opinion, whether you're 7 sections or 6 sections. And those were meant to happen. And again, no matter how you move ahead, I think some of this is also the projection of what you and we discussed with the community for a couple of years. What was the expectation? I don't think there's anybody behind me who probably thinks that you should just be building for the heck of it. There should be good purpose and why. But I think that there's a memory of certain things that you were thinking of building that you should continue to do. So again, you could make a decision, put them in the queue, keep looking at the process, keep discussing it, move on to middle school project to get everything else we can get going as much as we can. We could even grab some of the things that were supposed to happen here, piecemeal them out. We talked about that at one point. We could look at that with you, give yourself some breathing room.
If I may, I have one kind of curiosity question. If we was anticipating building 4 classrooms here over at the Miller Avenue School, and they're saying, no, you're not going to have the population to warrant that, so we'll let you build 2 more. Can we build a shell for 4, but not finish the 2 classrooms?
Yeah,
just do
sure.
the first 2?
Yeah. There was discussion about that even in pre-bond. Remember Jack bringing it up about some of the additions, could we, when you were looking at pre-K. You could build those spaces and leave them as shell, not completely fit them out later, save some money, absolutely.
To be clear, though, we could build. The question is, how much are they going to give us back in state aid? So we could build whatever we want.
Yes.
We could build that 6,000-seat amphitheater, but they're not going to give us anything more than what would be required for 60 people.
That's right.
So we could still build the classrooms.
Yes, you can.
We could plan for optimistic growth. We could plan for improving square footage per student. We could plan for not knowing what education of tomorrow is going to require in terms of added facilities, added learning capabilities, technology. We could plan for that, and maybe we don't need it, maybe we do. But if we don't plan for that, then we're kind of stuck.
That's right. Yes, I'll mention one other thought that I had is sometimes you could look at this and say, gee, I had 2 classrooms down the end of a hallway that were going to be proposed. Maybe they're not 2 classrooms, it's one big large space. It becomes a gathering space, it becomes another usable thing that we could do programmatically. Got to watch where this goes, though. One of the things I found in my career is there's land by acquisition. You leave an empty classroom in a building, and a building administrator and staff figure out what to call it. And I don't mean that in a bad way, but having done this as long as I have, I'm always shocked that I'll get a phone call from the superintendent, I think we have an empty classroom this year, and I show up in October and it's inhabited. So you'd have to have the memory that says, gee, when we have increased population, we have to kick out whatever went in that thing and get them out of there so the kids would fit. It's as simple as that. But you could rethink some of the spaces to get even more temporary use.
Well, if we had that situation, that would mean that whatever purpose was put in that room was probably shortchanged and not being functioning.
It could have been.
In its environment.
It could have been, absolutely.
I'm all for continuing on the path that we've outlined here. And,
is there a way to put a dollar amount on our decision?
Yeah, I was going to turn the plans.
Understanding that our state aid could change at any time?
Yeah, we can, we have they're called building aid units. State aid comes back and gives you BAUs, so we know what those dollar amounts are. We can tell you what the aid loss is to give you a sense of what that is. The other thing I was hoping was to be able to give our plans to Park East and just say to them, if you didn't build these 2 classrooms and these 4 classrooms, what's the value of those off the bids at this point? Just so you have all those numbers in the next several weeks to take a look at. Give you as much as you can so you have your, as many thinking ideas.
What are you suggesting, are you suggesting that the board take any action right now?
It isn't urgent tonight. I hate to say that to you, because we need some sense of urgency. But I'm going to suggest that you ponder for a short period of time. I don't know if that's going to be the next 30 seconds or not. Let me think this out. Of whether or not we should submit our drawings to get them in the queue. Because it's a 42-week process no matter what.
But you can always scale them back.
I can scale them back.
I would say put them in the queue.
Just throw them in the queue. Know that tonight we said to ourselves, and that would be number one, and that gives us the relief. Number two, allow us to have further dialogue with state ed, kind of open up all of your questions, throw them back to Steve and give some other ideas if you want, anything you want to know, we can ask him. It's all open now. It's not a process where you're hiding behind the bushes up there. Your plans, your preliminary plans are there, and the understanding is there. We can open some of that dialogue and try to help you make some of your decisions as you move ahead.
But then the question would be, we keep the footprint, but maybe submit the plans not as is, but as the footprints.
I would submit what I've drawn and then recognize that something could change, if that's what you're saying. Let me go back to Wading River specifically. We designed the addition to push out and the 4 classrooms to be in a courtyard.
Yeah.
I don't want to change that plan, not because I love it so much, but because I love it so much. Because in essence, if we take the 4 classrooms that we put in the courtyard and you didn't build them, then we've constructed the multi-purpose space away from the building in a wonderful location.
Yeah.
And you have the ability to come back in that courtyard and add those classrooms at a later date. Now, you could say, I have a better way to do that. I could put the wing over here. I could put it over there. We looked at that, and that argument comes out to about 800 square feet of hallway to argue over, to put yourself in a position that later on you could put the 4 classrooms right where they projected them to be.
Well, I just meant to build the structure, but maybe not to carve the classrooms. Use the end run.
You could build the volume.
Yeah, build the volume. Yeah.
Build the volume, you put the footings in. But for Jack, for that particular one, I'd want to have further construction dialogue, especially with you and Park East. If you're going to build those later, we usually do all of ours as steel frame and masonry infill. I would look at those 4 classrooms. If you're going to build them now, leave the steel frame. If you're going to build them later, let me not put them in as steel frame. Let those go in as load-bearing walls at a later date. 4 classrooms lined right up, stuck in a little cubicle. Put the bar joists right across them and put them in simpler later. But that's a dialogue that can take place. I don't have that drawn at this point, but it's a way for you to look at how could I build. You would say to yourself at a later date, how do I build that easier and cheaper, since I didn't do it the first time. Those are the kinds of arguments you can have with how you're planning ahead. But we'll move to the queue if it's okay with you. Get them in. Have further dialogue with state ed. Please give all your questions to Steve. We'll just keep feeding that back and forth. But they'll, at some point there'll be a trigger point that I'm going to say to Steve, somebody's got to make a decision what we're doing, because somebody's going to up there and say, these don't look like what your preliminary. Something looks different, or there's a dialogue that needs to be different. We need to catch up with that. If that's okay with you. If anything changes with that, we'll get back to you with the information.
Just don't call us and say you have to have a decision by tomorrow.
I really want to do that, but I know that's not a good thing, so. Okay.
Yeah.
I hope that's some help.
Do we have consensus to send plans up?
Yes, I
As
think
drawn?
I agree.
You have it in a loop, why not?
Okay.
Okay, good. That'll get the
Thanks,
process.
Roger.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Nope. Thanks.
Have a great holiday.
Next on old business is the subject of student memorials.
I just wanted to report to the board that Syntax is working with us to come up with some meaningful and tasteful kind of general memorial. That's where things stand. We don't have anything more specific because we are still discussing how specific we want the memorial to be. There are considerations about what the significance of that is for the kids. So we're still sort of wrestling with those issues. But Syntax is trying to come up with some ideas for a memorial that would be tasteful, that would not involve suggestions to the students that we don't want to suggest.
And in the interim, we've gotten a list from all of our principals
Yes, we
of all
have.
the existing memorials to ensure that they are properly updated.
Yes. That's being done.
On a slightly related note, I happen to notice in the high school, along the wall of the gym, we have a lovely row full of plaques. And the plaques are like, a lot of them are just falling apart. Can we do something about that?
I'm trying to get a lot in order over time, and that's one thing we definitely have to look at. I think we have to look at, I gotta work with Angelo, we have to take them all down and start fresh. A lot of them, things are broken off, the brass,
Yeah.
nameplates, or whatever you wanna call it, it's been kind of abused, and I think we've gotta get what we can to get it covered possibly, refresh it. Don't touch them, just go in.
Good. Next are reports and reviews. Dr. Cole?
Okay. I asked Mr. Haywood to put together an update on the New York State system of evaluation of teachers and principals. Brian? Famously known as APPR.
While they're getting that set up, I just wanted to let you know that what I'm presenting today is APPR as of right now, what the legislation is. It is continually changing. You'll see through the presentation how it has changed multiple times since last spring. Basically, the Education Transformation Act of 2015 affected 3 areas that I'm going to report on: probationary appointments and tenure eligibility for teachers, APPR redesign, and the expedited APPR disciplinary proceedings. Okay, the probationary appointments, the changes are that they're new 4-year probationary appointments. They may be reduced for teachers that were regular substitutes if they had an APPR reading the previous year. And they can also be reduced to a 3-year probationary period for teachers who had prior tenure provided. However, they must have had a final year, an APPR rating in their final year of service in another district. The tenure eligibility: classroom teachers and principals must receive an APPR rating of highly effective or effective in at least 3 of the preceding 4 years in order to be eligible to receive tenure, and they may not have an ineffective in their 4th year. And again, what would happen if a teacher did get a contingent in their, or the ineffective in their 4th year, they could be awarded contingent tenure until the time that they do get an effective rating there, or the tenure period could be elongated. Again, this just says that they do need to have 3 out of the 4 preceding school years have to be effective or highly effective. What we did, and as you saw in the personnel agendas, starting in July that we did have, when we had probationary appointments, we do have to outline this in the, where we typically would have a beginning and an ending date for probationary period. This, we do have this added language to explain that it would be dependent on the effective or highly effective. Again, as I said before, there are special considerations for teachers with prior tenure. They can have a 3-year probationary period. They must have received the APPR rating in their final year of service. This could pose a problem if you're getting a teacher, if the ratings are not out by the time that you're looking to appoint that person. If the ratings don't come out until the end of August and you're looking to appoint somebody in June for their, for the position to start in September. So there are some logistical problems that could be faced when appointing people in this manner. Regular substitutes are teachers that are in a long-term position. What happens if that was immediately preceding a probationary period in the past, that time could be counted. So if a teacher was hired in February to do a leave replacement for the rest of the year, and they were rehired in September as a probationary teacher, they would actually have a February tenure date. Now, that is no longer permissible unless they were in that position long enough to have received an APPR rating for the school year. Termination of probationary teachers and principals. One of the things is that the Board of Education still has the unfettered right to terminate a probationary teacher or principal for any statutorily permissible reason, including classroom performance. The APPR redesign, some of the major changes that have happened with this new legislation is the, just to give you the timeline, the regents were directed to adopt the regulations by June 30th. The emergency regulations were adopted on June 16th, 2015. The revised regulations were adopted on September 27th and became effective September 28th. And a permanent adoption of regulations were anticipated for this month. Okay, the APPR and state aid linkage continues. In order to receive state aid for the 15-16 school year, we would have had to have met the November 15th deadline for the new APPR plan, or which would have had to have been submitted by October 1st. However, we do have the option to do a hardship waiver, which our school district has done and has been accepted by the State Education Department. In that, we explained the reason for the hardship, or why more time was needed. We provided the evidence that good faith attempts were made to negotiate the APPR plan compliant with 3012D, and we provided evidence of staff training on the new APPR system. The hardship waiver is only for a 4-month period, so that we would need to reapply, because this would last up until March. So we would have to reapply in February if we were looking again, if we were not able to negotiate all the components of the new APPR. If we do have a plan in place by March, then that plan would be in effect for the 15-16 school year. If we do not have a plan in place and we get the waiver, the new plan would not go into effect until next September. Also, just with the waiver, the other requirements we did all of the things that we needed to, the certification forms in August, the staff evaluation data by October, and the verification of that information. I explain this. The new APR system retains the 4 ratings of highly effective, effective, developing, and ineffective. It still is required to be a quote-unquote significant factor for employment decisions. And however, different from the old system, we have 3 different categories. There are now 2 categories, and they are limited to a student performance category and a teacher observation and principal school visit category. The mandatory subcomponent is based on student growth on state tests, or where there are no state tests, a SLO or student learning objective, and courses that do have in a state assessment, such as the Regents, must use the state assessment as part of the SLO. An optional subcomponent is to have a second state-provided growth score based on a state assessment, but that would have to be negotiated with the teachers. Yes.
With that first one, the subcomponent on state tests, how does this new law handle opt-outs?
In order to, what happens now is you have to have a certain number of students in order to receive a score as a teacher. If you don't, the new legislation requires that you have a student learning objective as a backup. So part of the plan we would have, they are required to get a state score. If they don't have enough students, then they would be subjected to the SLO.
And what would be a legitimate SLO?
And that's what we're determining now. I'm going to go in a few minutes, but what the State Education Department is doing is that we are now, as part of the plan, they are required to approve anything that we would use as an assessment for a SLO. They do have a list on the state website where they are, as districts are getting them approved, or there are commercial assessments that are approved, they're being added to the list. However, the list is growing extremely slowly, and so we're in the process now of deciding what we would need to do, or what assessments we would like to either continue to use or new assessments that we would like to use in order to get it state approved. Okay, just said that. I think I pretty much got that. Okay, the targets obviously are would be left to the sole discretion of the superintendent, and they may take into account poverty, students with disabilities, and English language learner status, as well as prior academic history. The teacher observation category is based on a state-approved rubric. There are two mandatory components. One is that one classroom observation must be by a principal or other trained administrator in the building that that teacher is assigned to. And the second is that you have to have one classroom observation by an impartial, independent, trained evaluator, and that is an administrator or an evaluator that would be outside or who is not assigned to that building. And that could be, in our case, could be a director, could be another administrator that does not report to that particular building. And at least one of them must be unannounced. Another optional third component is to have a teacher who was rated effective or highly affected from the same school or from another school in the district to do a third observation of that teacher, and this is subject to negotiation. It is not required.
So you're saying the number of observations is capped?
No, you always have the right to go in and do additional observations. Okay, but this is saying that you are required to do the minimum of two, one of which must be by the building administrator, one is by an independent evaluator, and then again, you can do additional ones. We can have a requirement for non-tenured teachers to have more observations than a tenured teacher.
I thought you made a comment towards the end of that point earlier about some contractual obligation. I must have misheard you then. So that if an administrator decides they want to go visit classroom 5, 6, 7 times, there's nothing preventing them from doing that?
Right, if as an administrator I go in and I do an observation of a teacher and I have a concern about what I saw in there, you have absolutely every right to go back into that classroom to do an additional observation. The same thing for the principal school visits. There are two mandatory subcomponents, one visit by a supervisor or other trained administrator, and one visit by an impartial, independent, trained evaluator. Again, one must be unannounced. A third
Can I go
option.
back again? I'm sorry.
Sure.
If you can go back to that slide with the optional third subcomponent, and then just explain to me what that bottom paragraph means then.
The implementation is subject to negotiation, but however, it is not defined what implementation means. It could be interpreted to include the frequency, the duration, the use of video.
Right, so my question earlier, if somebody wanted to go multiple times, what is this? I'm not quite sure I understand what negotiation is required with regard to frequency.
When you're determining in the APR plan is the minimum number of observations. In the section you're indicating what is the minimum number that you would do.
Yeah, but this paragraph refers to the total number of observations beyond minimum. I understand that you can do as many informal observations as you desire, but if it's formal, does it have to be negotiated in this? Does it have to be negotiated?
And that's part of what it doesn't define what the implementation is. In the legislature, and this is based on the attorneys, they said they didn't define it, that what they're interpreting it to be is to include the frequency, the duration, and those other factors.
Okay.
Okay.
I still don't know the answer to my question. Well,
But
I'll follow up.
we don't, right? I mean, it's.
Because there is
You have
no,
to
there is,
negotiate if you want to. Is there some sort of form of negotiation required for additional observations? On an informal basis, I think you said no. So an informal observation, is that an observation that would not be incorporated in the APPR score?
Yes, that could be.
All right, so a formal observation is, if somebody wanted to include the results of a formal observation in an APR evaluation, that would be subject to negotiation?
That would be part of what the implementation negotiations would be. But it goes back to the whole factor is if a principal goes into a classroom and has concerns about student safety or something like that, they go back in again. You still, as a Board of Education, if it was recommended that teacher not be continued because the administrator went in 7 times after that, and still there was a safety concern that they had within there, you would still have the right, the unfettered right, to not continue
Safety,
somebody.
curriculum delivery, organization, effectiveness, all of those reasons.
Right. I think I went back too many. Okay, this shows the weighting of the categories. So if you get an ineffective on the student performance and an ineffective on these observations, automatic ineffective, and you can see just going down. If you get an ineffective on student performance but developing, you still cannot get anything higher than ineffective on the overall rating and so forth, just looking at the matrix. Again, this is just a summary of the things that needed to be negotiated, the student performance category, whether to use optional second component, which must be negotiated, teacher observation, principal visits category, the weighting and scoring, the appeals procedures in 3012C are carried forward, so that does not need to be negotiated again. Although the attorneys did say that that may be an issue with some of the bargaining units, that they may say that it would have to be negotiated again. The rubrics, although the list of rubrics continued, there's no automatic adoption of the current rubric, so that would be negotiated. And there's no requirement to negotiate over TIPS or PIPs. Beginning in the year 2016-17, as part of this regulation, a student may not be instructed for 2 consecutive years by a teacher or any 2 teachers that were rated ineffective. So if I'm a student in 3rd grade, I had a teacher rated ineffective. In my placement in 4th grade, I could not have a teacher who was rated ineffective the previous year as well, so it would be 2 years of being an ineffective teacher. This again poses a lot of concerns because when you're doing your student placements and everything, you're planning for the following school year, and they don't give you the APPR ratings until the week before school opens, it is a logistical difficulty.
Is there anything that prevents a student from getting an ineffective teacher into different subjects 2 years in a row? Or 2 ineffective teachers in the same year?
As far as a specific subject, that I would have to look into. You know, the legislation says by any 2 teachers in the same district who are ineffective rating. So I'm assuming.
Right, so basically, if you have
so
an
if I had a
ineffective math
teacher
teacher in 9th grade, you
and
can't
I
get
would
an
not-
ineffective math teacher in 10th grade, but
Right.
we can hit you with an ineffective English teacher.
That would be my interpretation. Under the 3020B, our new APPR termination process, in the past, you know, they were saying that it being rated ineffective, if you have 2 consecutives, the district may bring charges against the teacher, and that the hearing, the 3020A hearing, would be completed within 90 days. And however, the change is now, if a teacher gets 3 consecutive APPR ratings of ineffective, the district doesn't have a choice. They must bring charges against that teacher, and the hearing must be completed within 30 days. In this situation, the commissioner selects the hearing officer, which is in and of itself a frightening situation, because if you have a hearing officer that has the availability to complete a hearing within the next 30 days, you know that they're sitting home on their couch because they're not getting called a lot. So there is a provision that it could be extended by the school district to get a longer period than the 30 or the 90 days. Any other additional questions?
Yes, if I may. I'm just curious. You mentioned earlier that there's a minimum of 2 evaluations, one by the individual teacher's principal or assistant principal, whatever the case may be, and then someone from outside that building. Okay?
Right.
I'm Just curious, I'm going to use you as an example now. How many evaluations will you have to make throughout the school year for some of the staff? And what does that do to your effectiveness in your own job?
Well, when they say outside of the building, okay, it could be say a high school English teacher. They're getting they would get an observation by either the principal or the assistant principal within that school, because that's the building administrator. And the other one could be, the observation would be, could be done by the director of humanities.
Oh, okay.
So, or it could be, if it's a phys ed or a health teacher, it could be by the director of phys ed or health, or a special education director in that manner.
Okay. It's just that it seemed like, in one sense, extra work. To me, anyway.
Thank you.
Thank you, Brian.
In case of my daughter down in Florida, they're paid by how well they're raised based on their effectiveness in the zone. Okay.
Dr. Cohen, your report?
Thank you, Mr. Zukowski. To move from the ridiculous to the sublime. Kindergarten students visited Suffolk County Farm recently and had an opportunity not only to enjoy pumpkins, but to do some research into pumpkins. And they learned a lot about what kinds of pumpkins have how many seeds. And I visited a second grade class and was amazed at my ignorance about pumpkins. So that was a very interesting trip that they went on. At the secondary level, I have some important information from the middle school. Parent-teacher conferences. Conference day will be held on November 20th, and evening conferences will take place on November 23rd from 5:30 to 8:30. At the high school, Mr. Holtzman will be holding a parent information meeting on the new AP Capstone program on Wednesday, November 18th, as in tomorrow, at 6:30. Mr. Holtzman last week provided students in 10th and 11th grades with an introduction to the Capstone program. So the high school kids know about the program, and now the parents are invited to discuss details with Mr. Holtzman.
And there'll be enough time for the parents to get to the concert afterwards? Yes.
And the concert is at 7 p.m. So I think Mr. Holtzman is anticipating a very succinct presentation, and I'm sure that if there are follow-up questions, he'll make arrangements to deal with that.
Will you hold a seat in the concert for us? I prefer to sit on the right side.
And when you're done with the concert, you can go to an SAT meeting for parents, which will be on Thursday night at 5:30 to 6:30, and after that, you can go to Stony Brook for the game. And that's the news from primary and secondary.
When you
Thank
said
you, Dr. Cohen.
ridiculous to sublime,
Pardon?
when you said we're going from ridiculous to sublime, what was ridiculous?
From APPR
APPR was ridiculous.
to second graders, and then kinds of pumpkin seeds. Take that any day over APPR.
Yeah. It's easier to figure out.
Yeah.
Votes and resolutions. Any questions on the minutes of October 20th?
Not at all.
Motion to approve? Rob, second Mike, all in favor? All opposed? All abstained? Got that, Janice? And on the minutes of November 3rd, 2015, we have a request to pull the minutes because of an issue regarding one of the discussion items. We pull 11-3 until we have a chance to sort that out.
Thank you.
Any questions on CPSE, CSE? Motion to approve. Mike, second Rob, all in favor? 6-0. Any questions on the school financials? Motion to approve. Mike, second Rich, all in favor? 6-0. Resolutions. Resolution 15-16-080. I think we have a sentence that has to be added. Janice, can you just read the sentence that needs to be added to the end of that?
Yeah, after the second credit, where it says alternate 1.72 fiber type synthetic turf system, we're going to insert a line that says contract time shall be increased by 63 days with substantial completion extended to February 1st, 2016.
Motion to approve 15-16-080. Mike, second Sean, all in favor? All opposed? All abstained? Because I have an opportunity to explain my vote, I will. I'm not opposed to the project. I'm disappointed with the trajectory of the project. It was approved in May. This board made clear what its wishes were. The bidder gave us our choices for ad alternates. We selected the ones that we wanted. Those have been changed at the last minute through no fault of this board or administration. I'm not happy with the way the project was presented by either the bidder or the architect in this particular instance, and asking the board to again extend this project date. It had been extended once before. We sent it out for a rebid when we were not happy with the number. It came in at a significantly lower number, but we thought by now that we'd be very close to having our kids playing on this field. There was even some talk that maybe the championship football game could be, or semifinal games could be held here. We're not even close. So my dissenting vote has to do with the manner that this project has been handled, not with the project itself. I'm fully in support of a new field for the kids. I'm obviously fully in support of the dedication we made with respect to that field, but I am very unhappy with the way that the project has moved forward.